Donald Trump was firing on all cylinders this week. To take a look at what's been making headlines in the USA, co-host of Steve Bannon's War Room and our very own White House correspondent, Natalie Winters, joins me for this week's American Renaissance. Natalie, we're having an election here. Our Labor government has called an election for May 3rd. Now, I'm going to pick your brains. Who do you think Donald Trump might get along better with? The Labor Party, led by Anthony Albanese, whose calls Donald Trump still refuses to take, or Peter Dutton, who wants to kind of drill, baby, drill by opening more gas fields? Natalie.
Well, that may be the most difficult question that you've ever asked me. I think perhaps it's rhetorical. Look, I've done, I think extensive research. We all obviously, I think, viewed Australia as sort of a cautionary tale, certainly for Chinese Communist Party involvement and investment and just really allowing a country to cede its sovereignty to foreign powers and throw by the wayside civil rights and individual liberties. And I think for a government that has allowed millions, right? What is it? 1.5 million migrants to essentially overwhelm your country. I don't think the Australian people ever voted for that. There's something uniquely distinct and wonderful about Australian culture. And voting for someone who doesn't see any merit in that, doesn't believe that Australia is something worth protecting and preserving, that's a non-starter. And I think if you look really deep down, what compelled so many Americans to go and vote for President Trump, it was the idea that America, or frankly, any leader who's running for any office in any country, it shouldn't be controversial to say that the country that you want to represent and the people that you are asking for their vote, that you think that there's something worth preserving and protecting there, whether that be in the energy space, the economic space, or immigration policy. So I think the choice is very, very clear, not just from an American perspective. We'd love to have wonderful allies, but I think you guys know what to do.
Absolutely. And Natalie, you won't be surprised that the Labor Party sat twiddling their thumbs while the Chinese, you mentioned the Chinese communists, there was a Chinese naval fleet firing live weapons only last month, and it was a Virgin Air pilot who notified our government, which shows you how seriously our Labor left-wingers take the threat of China. But back to the States, the lunatic left over there are in meltdown across the States, and there's disgusting vandalising of Teslas because they don't like Elon Musk, who was, of course, once the darling of the left. Have a look at what Trump had to say about this.
When I looked at those showrooms burning, and those cars, not one or two, like 7, 8, 10 burning, exploding all over the place. These are terrorists. You didn't have that on January 6th, I can tell you. You didn't have anything like that on January 6th. We're going to be caught, and they're going to be caught, and they're going to be prosecuted. And from what they tell me, I see this just by watching your programs and reading the news, but from what they tell me, they could get 20 years in jail, and they'll get it. I'll tell you, there's going to be no leniency, and there'll be no pardons.
How much anger is there, Natalie, about this wanton vandalism, showrooms being torched, cars being scratched and vandalised? How much anger is there in the States?
Well, that anger is actually organic and fueled by the actual American people, the people who are burning down these cars. They're part of these far left, dark money groups that are being paid to do a lot of this. Groups like Indivisible, it's one of the leading kind of left-wing activists, where we've actually uncovered documents showing how they're reimbursing people who will hold anti-Musk, anti-Tesla events $200 just to show up and oppose President Trump for whatever reason they see fit. So there's a lot of anger, and frankly, it goes back to the 2016 resistance tactics that Democrats have always used when they don't get their way. I guess they didn't win the House of Representatives, so they can't impeach President Trump. So instead of doing that, they're trying to bully and really use these bizarre kind of color revolution, regime change tactics because they don't like the president that the American people elected. So they're doing what they've done to countries abroad, right? Like we've seen that happen time and time again. Now we're seeing them use those same tactics to try to astroturf and engineer change here at home.
And how much anger amongst the public, the broad public? Do they watch all this and go, what are you lunatics doing? What are the left doing? Surely, Joe Blow, the Americans' public must think this is insane.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think people conflate this with the mainstream Democratic Party, right? You saw their behavior at that joint session, the stuff they wouldn't applaud for. And frankly, I think you and I both know the stuff that they would applaud for, and that is the burning down and vandalizing of private property. I mean, look, the World Economic Forum tells us you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Obviously, the left doesn't believe in private property ownership. So, of course, they're not going to take issue with burning down anything, even if it's some, eco-friendly green electric vehicle.
There's been an awful lot of squealing from the left about the Signal chat leak. This is where the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz somehow allowed the editor of The Atlantic, a Trump-hating left-wing rag, to kind of receive the details about the attacks on the Houthis in advance. Now, if it was The Apprentice, I imagine Waltz or even Hegseth might have been fired by now. But what's the reaction from the White House?
Yeah, certainly an unforced error. I don't think anybody from the White House is trying to spin it as otherwise. What they're really focusing on, though, is sort of a distinction I think that we see a lot plague Washington here, which is the idea that we have to focus on process, right? So much of this story is about, oh, what went wrong and the sort of planning, what the White House is now describing as a substantive policy discussion. They're rebuking and not really, I think, taking the Atlantic's characterization of this as war plans or attack plans. They're focusing rather on the success, right, of these strikes, the success of President Trump taking on the Houthis, when in contrast, you had Biden taking them off the foreign terrorist list, but also letting 150 plus strikes on commercial and otherwise maritime vessels happening in that region. And it went by, I didn't see anyone in the press briefing room asking questions about that. They're more outraged over the Signal discussion than they are Americans being attacked by a radical terrorist group. So there's obviously that double standard. And this Jeffrey Goldberg character is someone who is, shall we just say, quite curious and very anti-Trump. But on the other hand, I think questions still remain as to why Mike Waltz had this number in the first place. It's obviously under review, but the biggest thing that I think people should take away is that these are text messages that Jeffrey Goldberg had over a week before there was a Senate hearing coming up where all of these people were going to be essentially testifying about foreign threats and their analysis on them. And he intentionally withheld publishing this story. They wanted to drop it, I would argue, colluded with the Democrats just ahead of that hearing so they could essentially make this the ultimate maximum smear campaign and pressure campaign, really to try to force the resignations of none other than Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth.
Wow, that's amazing. Yes, I absolutely, I'm sure you put your finger on it right there, Natalie Winters. Thanks so much for your time. And people, of course, can watch you on The War Room, Steve Bannon's War Room. That's Natalie Winters. Thanks so much, Natalie. We'll speak again next week.
Thank you.